Take your Bibles with me, if you would, and turn to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're going to look at a couple of verses actually one verse in chapter 1, two verses in chapter 1, and then we're going to go over to chapter 2 for a little bit and be going around several passages in the Bible this morning as we begin a new 3-week series entitled Unchained. And what I want to talk to you about over the next few weeks is about how we as individuals and we as a church need to employ biblical stewardship, specifically in the area of how we handle debt. The fact of the matter is that debt is a growing problem in our country today. A few years ago, we saw firsthand what happens when debt gets out of control in a nation. In fact, you can look around the world today, and if you want to look at a history of what the biggest problem in many of our nations around the world today are, it's the problem of debt. Greece has a great debt crisis. Almost all of Europe has a great debt crisis. We've had our own. If you look back over the recession that happened a few years ago, essentially it boils down to this. Mortgage companies started offering subprime loans to people who under normal circumstances would not have been able to borrow money for a house. And now it sounds kind of like a good thing. Hey, man, they're helping people out. But in reality, what was happening is they were loaning money to people who were going to default, who were buying more house than they could afford. I remember when we first moved here, this was right, the recession had not quite broke out, and we went around and looked for houses. We looked for, Cliff, if he ever stops being a preacher, could maybe be a real estate agent, all right? Cliff knew every house for sale in Massac County. He took us there, told us what they were asking for it, what they should be asking for it, what we should pay for it. He took us all over the place, and we ended up finding the house that we eventually bought. And I remember when we went to the bank over in Paducah to talk to him about the loan, I'll never forget, the lady said to me, she said, you could borrow about twice that amount of money. You could borrow a lot more money if you wanted to. I said, well, I could do that, but I couldn't pay it back. And I think you're going to want me to pay it back. The reality is that's what was happening. We were borrowing more money than we could pay back. Now, the banks knew that a certain portion of these borrowers were default. They would loan them more money than they knew. They knew, though, they were counting on this, that if the housing prices continued to go up, and I can remember a friend of mine in Richmond who got caught in all of this situation. And I remember him saying to me, the housing market in America will never decline. Never has, never will. That was untrue. It had once before. It happened in the Great Depression. It happened again just a few years ago. And when the housing market crashed and those prices all began to fall, banks began to default left and right. And you remember the carnage. It was the greatest economic recession since the Great Depression of the 1920s. And we are very fortunate that we didn't have an even greater problem. What they were counting on was presumption. They assumed that the housing prices will go up. They assumed that people would be able to finance those loans down at a certain place. Or even if they did, that small number that would default would be offset by the mass number of people that would pay their loans off. What happened basically, now we can sit there and we can blame the government, we can blame it. Here's the bottom line. What almost destroyed the American economy was Americans borrowed more than we could repay. Just as simple as it is, we borrowed more money than we could repay. And the fact of the matter is that is always a recipe for economic disaster. Consumers bought things they could not afford on credit and eventually caught up with them. Sadly, the statistics today show us we are right back in the same position we were almost a decade ago. According to a recent study, listen to this, the average American home has $132,000 in total debt. $15,000 of that is in credit card debt. See, those little cards we carry around in our pocket are one of the great sources of debt. Listen to this. In total, this is just American consumers. This is not counting our government debt. If we counted our government debt, the numbers would scare you to death. You would never come back. All right, listen to what it said. $712 billion Americans owe in credit card debt, $8.3 trillion in mortgage debt, $1.7 trillion in auto loans, and $1.26 trillion in student loans. That's how much we owe. I didn't add that up. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. That consumer debt is almost as large as the federal debt that we owe from the federal government. The reality is that we need to get unchained from debt. We need to find some ways to work our way out of debt. So over the next couple of weeks, I want to talk to you about what the Bible says about debt. That's what we're going to do this morning. Look at what does the Bible say about debt. We're going to talk about how debt can damage our future and threaten our future next week. And then we're going to talk the third week about how it can hamper our mission. And our goal is twofold. Number one is to help you understand how to get out of debt yourself, how to look at your own personal finances, and not do it because the pastor told me to, but look at the Bible and say, what does the Bible have to say about this? What does the Word of God teach us about how we should handle debt? And then think about how do you pay off your debt, and then how do we as a church pay off our debt? And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few moments. First of all, if we're going to understand debt, we've got to understand one of the big problems is the motivation. Why do people get in debt? They want to buy things that they think they need. They're going to buy things that they think that's going to bring satisfaction. In fact, this is one of the great problems in America. The underlying cause of the debt problem in the United States is greed. It's based on an idea that material things will bring us true satisfaction. And the first point I want to make today is things can never make us content. Things can never make us satisfied. Look at what Solomon has to say about this. And Solomon, in the very first chapter of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, the wisest man in the Old Testament, right? He's the wisest man in the Old Testament in many ways. Listen to what he says. It says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That word there, vanity, is a rather interesting Hebrew word. It means, and it's kind of hard to translate exactly what he's trying to get at, but basically what he's saying is that everything in this life that we think brings us great value ultimately is worthless. I preached a sermon here many, many years ago where I used an example of cotton candy. How many of you like cotton candy? Cotton candy is awesome, right? I mean, it is sweet, it tastes good, but do you ever notice something about a cotton candy? There's no substance to it. You put it in your mouth. What does it do the moment you put it in your mouth? Disappears. It's gone. It dissolves. There's no substance to it, right? That's why you can get full on a steak, but you can never get full on cotton candy. Why? There's no substance to cotton candy. It just kind of disappears. That's the same concept he's using. He's saying the things that we think in life that will bring us true contentment, true satisfaction, are like our vanities. They just disappear. When we try to bite into them, when we try to find satisfaction, they just disappear and they go. In fact, in chapter 2, he kind of elaborates on this. Solomon says, let me tell you about my own experience in this. In chapter 2, he begins to outline some of the steps that he has taken to try to find this. First of all, he says, I try to just find pleasure. We call that hedonism. I'll find meaning sort of in a partying lifestyle. I'll find it by finding pleasure. So notice what he says in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. He said, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. He's getting there into the second area, but he says, first of all, I tried to party. I tried to just enjoy life, and I found out that, listen, there's more to life than that. Listen, how many of you have ever figured out there'll be some hard times in life? In addition to the good times and the party, he says, I found out that was vanity. He said, I built things. And beginning there in verse 4, he says, I made great works. I built houses. I planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which water the forest for growing tree. I bought male and female slaves and slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. He's saying, listen, I tried it all. I tried materialism. Hedonism, partying didn't bring me satisfaction. We all know that, right? One of these days you wake up, the partying lifestyle, you wake up, you find out, wow, that really didn't satisfy me. The next morning it's not so exciting. So he said, I went out and I decided to try materialism. I made a lot of money. I built a lot of houses. I built great works around me. I did all kinds of things to acquire material goods, and none of those ever brought satisfaction to my heart. You know, that's the weirdest thing about it. We think that if we make a certain level of money, if we have a certain size house, if we have certain material possessions, then somehow it will satisfy us. Boy, if I just had a little nicer house, I think I'd really be happy. We buy a little bit bigger house, and the guy that we work with buys a little bigger house than we had. And then we find out, well, I just don't think that's big enough. And so I'm going to have to buy a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. We do that with cars all the time. I remember the first time when I was 16, I could not wait to buy a car. I had saved up a little bit of money. I was working a job and trying to put some money back. And I went out and I bought a car, and my buddy got a little bit nicer car. And you know what happened? My car, that was the greatest thing in the world to me 2 weeks ago, all of a sudden didn't look so hot, didn't look so great anymore. What happens? That's what materialism does. He says none of these things will satisfy our heart. He goes on later in those verses and talks about wisdom and knowledge. He said, I tried to acquire lots of wisdom, lots of knowledge. What he's reminding us here is that things don't satisfy us. We're created as spiritual beings. We're created. Our deepest satisfaction comes not from things, but from relationships. First and foremost, our relationship with God. If we don't have that settled, then nothing else works in our life, because Genesis 1 tells us we're created in the image of God. We're created with a capacity and for the purpose of having a relationship with Him. So things don't satisfy us, relationships satisfy us. That's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Jesus reminds us that where our heart is, that's going to be determined by what the things we value the most. And if we value material things, our passion's going to be here on earth. And we're never going to truly find the kind of satisfaction. You know, here's the thing about this thing on earth. Houses get old. Cars get dented. And rust out. Money slowly loses its value due to inflation. The lie of materialism is that material things can satisfy our spiritual cravings. So here's what we do. We end up borrowing money more and more and more to buy more and more and more stuff. But here's the problem. The more stuff we have, the more we recognize that it didn't satisfy our hearts. So what do? We buy more stuff. A couple years ago, I started doing a little bit of bass fishing. All right? Bass fishing is the worst sport in the world for getting you into materialism. Amen, guys? All right? Because here's what happens. I was perfectly content with my fishing rod and my fishing pole, and then Mike took me out and showed me his fishing pole. And I was like, boy, he's got a lot nicer fishing pole than I got. Man, I'm telling you what, he can feel that fish so much better with his pole. I better go get one of those. So I get one of those, and then, you know what happened? Mike bought another one. And he buys a little better one, and he buys this, and he buys everything. Every time, then what happens? We think, and then I pick up a fishing magazine. It's a, boy, if you had this kind of fishing pole and this kind of bait, and you catch more fish. Can I tell you a little secret? I can't catch anything. You could give me a submarine with bass fishing torpedoes on it, and I still couldn't catch bass. You understand? What happens, it drives us. We think, I'm going to find satisfaction if I can just get a little bit more. What we need to learn is that true satisfaction, true contentment in life does not come from things. True contentment comes from, first of all, a relationship with God, but also from being a good steward. Remember, I told you a moment ago, in Genesis, God creates us with that capacity to have a relationship, but he also gives us a purpose. In Genesis 1:28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. What God is doing there, he's taking Adam and Eve, and he's saying to them, here's everything I've created. Here's the whole earth. Now, you are going to be a steward of that. Now, let me tell you about a steward. There's a couple of things we've got to understand about being a steward. Steward means we don't own any of it. God owns it all. Everything that's on this earth, including all of your possession, God owns those. Those are his. We don't own a single blessed thing as human beings. But we have had things placed under our dominion. We've had things placed at our hands, at our disposal, so that we can be good stewards of those things. Think about the resources that God has given us. He's given us a number of them. He gives us time. Does God expect us to use our time wisely? Absolutely. In fact, time is really the most, as you get a little older, you're going to figure this out. Time is the most precious thing we have. Time's the one resource that cannot be saved whatsoever. We like to talk about time-saving things. About every other week, I'll get something in my email box that says, Pastor, save time doing this. You can't save time. You can't put time back and use it later. You invest time. But every moment that you have and that you sit and you do things, that's a moment that we're not going to get that last minute back. Wouldn't it be awesome to have a rewind tape? Just rewind. I'd rewind back to about 1986. All right, and I'd like to do that year one more time. All right, I'd like to do this again. I'd like to do that again. Or sometimes we've had mistakes. I wish I could go back and redo that. But you know what? That never happens. Time just keeps on moving along, right? It just keeps marching forward in our lives. We can't get a single moment. God has put time at our disposal, and he expects us to use it. And someday we're going to wake up you realize that. You realize how fast time is going. My mom says to me every once in a while, just amazed how much, as the older you get, the faster time goes. You know that. You remember that as a child. Remember as a child, summer vacation used to last forever? And then you become an adult and it's like, hey, they just started it yesterday and now they're gone back to school. So everything goes by so much faster. That's because time doesn't stop. We've been given time to. We have talent. We have natural abilities and spiritual gifts that God has given us to accomplish his will and purpose. Every single one of us has talents. We've been given treasure. We have financial resources that God expects. He's placed it at his thing. Sometimes there's a myth in the Baptist churches. Well, God is interested in the first 10% of your income. That's not true. He's not interested in 10%. He's interested in 100%. It's not just what you give, it's how you use every single dime that God has provided you. So being a good steward of our time, our talent, our treasure, our temple, our bodies, everything that God has placed in our resource, we are to be using for his glory. Stewardship begins, as I mentioned a moment ago, with three basic premises. Number one, God is the owner of all things. Number two, I own nothing. Number three, one day I'm going to be judged on how I use what God put at my disposal. Go in there, I have to stand before God, and God's going to say, hey, I've given you these talents. What did you do with them? And I'm going to have to answer for that. He's going to say, hey, man, I gave you this much time. How'd you use it? He's going to say, hey, I gave you this much treasure. How did you use it? Everything that God has placed in our hands, we have to answer for one of these days. So let's think about that. As a church, we have resources. God's given us a time, so we have to plan our calendar, and we have to use it properly and say, okay, I want to make sure that throughout the year and as we plan the things, the activities we do, we want to make sure we're investing our time in the right things. We have talent. We want to make sure that we employ the spiritual gifts and abilities of our members in the right place. And that's really a big part of the job of our staff and our leadership, figuring out, hey, man, that person's got a real gift in the area of worship. We need to get them on the worship team. That person has a real gift in encouragement. We need to get them over on this ministry team. That person has a real gift of administration. We need to get them in the office as quickly as we can. We got this person who has a gift of teaching. We need to get them employed over here. That's what we're trying to do, getting the time and the talent. But we also have treasure. We have financial resources. God says to us as a church, we have to use every dime that comes in here. We take that very seriously. Every dime that comes in, we want to be able to account for and be able to say, are we using that in a biblical way? Are we making sure that we're not just wasting money? We want to stay focused. This is the mission. This is the purpose for which God has created us. So we built this building. We did not build this building. Now, some of you are new here and haven't been here all this time, but we used to be down at 6th and Girard. We were there for over 100 years on that corner, and a number of buildings and different, segments there. And before I ever came along, the church had decided to purchase the property here and move our building out here. Now that was, by the way, not motivated by a desire for First Baptist to say, we need to build a big fancy building so that we can show off how great we are. Rather, it was motivated by a desire to create a place where we could extend our mission. In fact, if you'll remember, we talked over and over again while we were in the building process that this building was simply an extension of our mission. What was its purpose? Its purpose was to help us reach our community with the gospel, and we've done that. We've seen more and more people coming to know Christ as a result because we've had a little more space. We've had a better place to do children's ministry. We've had a little bit of space to do youth ministry, adult ministry. All of those things have been better housed here than they were down in the old building. And we want to be good stewards. We had a lot of repairs on that old building and a lot of things that were going to eventually cost us and hinder our growth. So we said, well, it's a good investment to go and build the building. And by the way, the recession a few years ago actually helped us with that. It's kind of a weird moment when all of the building costs and material costs dropped, and all of a sudden we had this window of opportunity that let us build this building. But in order to do that, not only we had saved a fairly sizable chunk of money, we had to borrow money. And as good stewards now, we have to repay that debt. Now, by the way, that was a wise debt to incur, was it not? It was because what's it done? It's allowed us to extend and build our kingdom, but we also have to pay it off. God gives us some specific instructions about how to handle debt. Let me talk to you about those for a minute. It's probably a good place to stop here just for a second and say, let me tell you what God does not say about debt. All right? And instead, I'm going to tell you what he tells us about debt in a moment, but let me tell you what he does not tell us, because there's a lot of myths about debt that float around Christian world sometimes that God has never endorsed or said. They're just kind of ideas that we've got. First of all, God never says anywhere, does not say that it is wise to borrow money. He doesn't condemn it. He never says don't borrow money, but he never says that it's wise either. Back during the recession, back during the heyday of the economic bubble and the real estate bubble, we had a lot of people saying it's wise to borrow. I'll never forget. The guy I was telling you about in Richmond came to me one time, and he had borrowed on a tremendous amount of money. What he was doing was he was going and buying real estate, all right, completely on margin. He would go out and he would borrow enough to buy a house or an apartment complex or whatever he was happening to buy. He would buy it completely on debt. All right, just borrow the money. And then he would collect the rents from that and was paying it off. And things were going very well for him. He came to me and he said, Pastor, you need to get involved in this. I can show you how, with no money down, to make incredible amounts of money. I'm telling you, I am rolling in the cash. I can show you. And he kept saying, you are being a bad steward by not borrowing more money. You hear what he was saying? You're being a bad steward. He kept saying, it's wise to borrow money because look at how much money I'm making on this deal. Do you know what happened when the housing market? He had one deal that went south, and he lost everything. Almost lost his own home that he lived in. And he's still paying off debt. He's still trying to figure out how to get out of it. What happened was he thought it was wise to borrow more money. And it's not. It's not a very good idea. The Bible never advises that we use debt to accomplish economic goals. It never advises that. Now, it doesn't forbid it. The Bible does not say that it is a sin to borrow money. That's kind of the counter to that. It doesn't advise us to borrow money, but it also doesn't say it's a sin to borrow money. There are times in the Bible where, that people can borrow money. For instance, or borrow money for things like medical bills at times, education, shelter, those kind of things. It never says that it's a sin, but he does say that we must pay it off. I'll get to that in just a moment. The third thing that God does not say in the Bible is he does not say that God will bail us out of debt. This is where a lot of Christians live, and it's scary. Well, I'm going to borrow this money, and if it doesn't work out, God will bail me out. God will bail me out. It's kind of the equivalent. We think of him kind of like what investors thought of the federal government. Oh, we'll do all this. We'll make a lot of irresponsible and dumb decisions, and then the government will step in and bail us out. That's what happened in the American economy, but that's not always what God does. In fact, that's living on presumption. When we make bad financial decisions, we know that in other areas. When you make bad decisions in your life, does God always bail you out? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, what does he do? He lets you deal with the consequences of your sin to teach you a lesson. You do that sometimes as a parent, right? You say, well, I remember, had a nephew who liked to go and touch the stove, and hot stove. He was always putting his fingers up there, so one day they just kind of let him tap it. Oh, he didn't get hurt bad. He didn't get third-degree burns. He didn't catch on fire, but he got a little burn on his finger. Guess what he never did again? He never touched the stove. Sometimes we assume that when we make bad decisions, God will step in and he will bail us out, and nothing can be farther from the truth. So what does the Bible tell us about debt? Two things that are very important. First of all, we must never presume on the future. One of the mistakes that happens when we get in debt is we presume that we know all of the stuff that's going to happen in the future. We do not. We do not. A few years ago, my friend in Richmond would have told you there is nothing more secure in all of the world than American housing economy. Nothing. It's never gone down. He believed the myth that nothing bad could happen because he was in a rock-solid, stable investment. And what happened? The bottom fell out. The unexpected occurred, and he lost everything. We cannot presume on the future. In James chapter 4, verses 13 through 15, this is what he says. He says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time that vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. The reality is we do not know what tomorrow holds. And to be massively in debt is an unwise position. We need to understand that we don't know what the future holds. We would love to assume. I'll give you an example of that. My daughter right now, they're in their social studies class is talking about steel industry in America. When I was a kid, I grew up in an area. I grew up in steel country. I grew up where they made it. My dad worked in a steel mill for 48 years of his life. My brother just retired from that same place. There was nothing more sure in all of the world where I grew up than the steel industry. Everybody I had ever known had in some way or another profited from that industry. We had a mill that was the sixth largest producer of steel in the world. In World War II, 80% of the shells made to fight in Italy were made in Weirton, West Virginia at Weirton Steel Corporation. The steel that lined the atomic bomb that won the World War II for us, the steel on that was made in Weirton, West Virginia. It was an incredible mill. It employed 5,000 employees, and I kid you not, it was larger than the city of Metropolis. The particular part of that mill my dad worked in was the tallest building in the state of West Virginia. They could produce every 20 minutes 300 tons of raw steel every 20 minutes. It's amazing. All of it gone. All of it gone. Today in that area in Pittsburgh, y'all know Pittsburgh Steel Town, our football team's named after the steel industry. There's one mill. There were hundreds when I was a kid. We all presumed they'd always be there. We presumed that nothing could ever happen to that. Now that's just one instance, but you know that. We look down the road and we say, man, will our economy always still this? Will the places that we rely on today for jobs, will they always be here? Maybe. Maybe not. We presume our country's always going to be stable. Maybe. Maybe not. We know that. On this day, we remember, my goodness, how long it seems to be. I walked out of my house today. And I looked up and I thought, boy, this just looks like that September day, doesn't it? I remember on that morning walking out of my house, looking at the most beautiful blue sky in the world. I had never seen a sky look so pretty as it did that morning. Isn't that weird how you're driving over? I was driving over to Open Door Baptist Church and thought, wow, look, it's going to be a great day. And then I get a phone call from my wife. Back then we didn't have the internet. Can you believe that? I didn't have the internet. I didn't have a cell phone. None of those things were even in my mindset. And my wife called and said a plane has flown into and everything changed. By the end of that day, that crystal blue sky was no longer an object of beauty to be admired. It was something that my son and I stood out and wondered, is there going to be more terror come out of that sky? See, the world changes in a moment. It doesn't change over a long period. It can change in a heartbeat. Some of you that were seniors remember that on the day on December 7th when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The world can change in a heartbeat. And to presume that we know what's going to happen and hold a massive amount of debt and hold on to is presumption. I'm not saying it's sin to be in it, but I am saying that we need to pay it off as quickly and as rapidly as we can. Proverbs 22:3 says, the prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. So the prudent looks out and recognizes we live in a dangerous and a challenging world, a world of uncertainty. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what emergencies lie in our future, what economic downturns we may encounter. That's like as people, we know that someday we're going to have to retire. We're going to have health bills. We need to prepare for that. And one of the ways we can prepare for that is to get out of debt. Number 2, not only does the Bible tell us we must never presume upon the future, but we must always pay back our debts. Psalm 37:21 says, the wicked borrow and do not repay. Romans 13:8 says, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. I remember my cousin came to me a number of years ago. He had to file bankruptcy. He owned a little convenience store. It was A little bigger than what we think of as a convenience store. Up there, they call them convenient food marts, but they're more like a small grocery store. Okay, they're like a convenience store with a lot more groceries and no gas pumps. All right, and he owned one of these, and it's fairly successful. But he lived along the Ohio River in an area that, as long as I can remember, had never flooded. Had never flooded. It was up higher. The river up there is a little different than it is here. It's a lot more narrow and a lot deeper. But the water had never come up to where his store was. And one year, it came up, and it flooded his store out. And no one in that area, on that particular area where he was located, had flood insurance. There was no reason to. It never flooded there. Nobody had ever remembered it ever flooding in that particular part of town. It seemed to be above the 500-year floodplain. There was no reason for him to buy it, and he didn't have it, and he lost everything. And he ended up having to go and borrow a lot of money to try to reconstruct his store, replace his inventory, pay some of the things that he had to do. He had to borrow a lot of money. And what happened was the business never quite recovered. It just never recovered. He worked hard at it. He's a good guy. Worked hard, tried to make it work. But he eventually just couldn't keep up. And he had to file bankruptcy. And he came to me and he says, do I have to pay that debt back? And I said, biblically, yes, you have to pay the debt back. Bankruptcy is a great way to get yourself out from under the pressure and negotiate, but you have to biblically pay off the debt. You have to pay back what you borrow. I said, that's what the Bible says. I'll never forget, he went and sat down with the creditors around town. They all thought Bill Coher had lost his mind. He went down there to the Wheeling Grocery, wholesale grocer, and he said, I'm going to repay this debt back to you. They said, Bill, you don't have to pay us back. The bankruptcy court has said, you don't owe that anymore. You don't have. He says, but God says I still do. And I'm going to pay back a little bit at a time. And he went to every single creditor that he owed, and he told them all the same thing. I'm going to pay you back what I can, when I can, and I'm going to eventually repay all this debt. Him and his wife had made a decision. They both went out and got jobs. Any raises that they got, they would put towards the debt. Any extra money that they had come in, they would put towards the debt. Anything that came over and above what their budget was, they were going to put on that debt. They owed, I forget what it was several $100,000. It was a lot of money for that part of the world. And it seemed like he'll be repaying that debt till he is 85 years old. He's never going to be able to get that out. You know what happened? Over the next 3 years, God blessed him. And he repaid every single debtor. Many of them came to him and said, Bill, why are you doing this? Why are you paying off that debt? Why are you doing that? You don't have to. The law says you don't have to. And he said, but God says I do. And he repaid every single dime of what he owed. What happened was there was a guy just living out the biblical principle. Now, we have to pay off our debt. Let me tell you how this applies individually. Individually, we need to be good stewards of what God has given us. That means, first of all, don't acquire more debt than you can repay, and repay your debts as quickly as possible. One of these days, there'll be another severe economic downturn. We'll have it. I just read you the statistics that said we're in as much debt in America today as we were back in 2007. We're in the same situation. We're in the same boat now as when it all went to pot back then. What's going to happen? One of these days, we're going to have another big downturn. Wouldn't it be wise to be ready for it? Wouldn't it be wise to be one of those guys out there with actual cash in your hand instead of just a bill? Pay it off as quickly as you can. The other thing about that is, not only does that honor God and protect you against a few, but it also frees up those resources to be used for other things. As a church, we need to do that. It was not wrong for us to borrow money to build this building. We needed to do it. It was what God wanted us to do. I'm convinced of that. God has blessed it. But now, what do we have to do? We have to pay it off. Some of you have been doing that for years. When Brother Brinker first brought the idea to you about let's build out there and purchase the property. And some of you have been pledging money and giving faithfully and consistently to this building program for over a decade. Thank you. Amen. Thank you. You have been a faithful and godly steward. Keep doing that, by the way. But if you haven't, some of you are brand new. Some of you have just come in the last 4 or 5 years and you never knew anything about the building project. You never knew anything about all that. Over and above your tithe and offering, pray about it over the next few weeks and say, God, what would you have me to contribute to that? It's not my job to tell you how much you're supposed to give or try to bend your arm. But just listen to the messages, pray about it, say, God, what would you have me to do? And then do that consistently. You know what will happen is the debt will get paid off. The church will be free. Can you imagine what it would be like if we can hand off to the next generation of members of First Baptist Church this building, this facility, this property, debt-free? Wouldn't it be much better? You know, we pay, and I don't know down to the penny, but we pay a little over $18,000 a month on the mortgage payment on this building. Do you know what we could do with $18,000 a month? That's additional staff. We could fund by ourselves multiple missionaries that we could send out into the world just from the mortgage payment we saved. You realize the kind of ministries that we could start and we could do here if we didn't have that? And then next economic downturn. Oh, I remember. Boy, a few years ago when that first hit, that economic downturn. I can show you this on our giving dropped one year. I can't tell you what, I think it was 2007 or maybe 2008. When we did our church study here a couple years ago, we did all the survey work. We also did a compare. We had a decrease in our giving of $300,000 one year. You remember that? That's the year I about lost my mind. Anybody want to guess why? That happened. We went from taking in nearly $1 million the year before to far less than that. Man, we were wondering. We're in the middle of a building program. How are we going to pay for it? God's provided. But as He provides, we have to be good stewards. Amen? We have to figure out biblically how do we do this. So next week I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about it. And then the following week tell you about how it can advance the mission. We're just going to walk through. Today, what's the Bible say? The Bible says don't take on more debt than we can handle. Make sure that we pay off every debt that we owe. And don't presume on the future. Don't think just because it's going good now, it'll always be that way. Every time in our history, we know good times followed by hard times. That's just life. We have ups, we have downs. The wise are prepared for the downs before they happen. Amen? Let's stand, every head bowed, every eye closed. Father, I pray that you would speak to our hearts today. Lord, speak to our hearts about this issue of how we handle, how we are good stewards of the resources you've given us. Lord, this is just as important a part of the gospel, of living out the gospel, as anything else we do. Because, Father, one of the things that hinders us from being able to be involved and extend the mission is how we deal with the resource. Are we good stewards? And I pray today, Father, that you would put in our hearts a desire, Father, to get unchained from financial debt, both as individuals and families and as a church, Father. Lord, I pray that you'd speak to our hearts. Lord, that whatever you'd have us to do, you just tell us. Father, we'd be willing as individual members of this church to be involved in it, Father, to make a commitment. Lord, to give graciously and faithfully to the work of the church, to make that investment of paying off that debt. Father, thank you for this incredible resource of this building. Father, we never want to regret that, Father. You've given us this incredible resource. You have used it already, Father, to bring people into the kingdom, Father. You've used it, Father, to extend our ministries. You've made it a missionary sending center right here in southern Illinois. Father, I pray now that we would get unchained from the debt, so Father, that we could see you do even more. Father, help us to be good stewards of all that you've given us. We love you, we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray.